I was 6 when I found my grandfather's body. The nightmares never stopped. The morning of October 9th began like any other Tuesday. I woke to the smell of my grandmother's buckwheat porridge drifting up the stairs, the golden autumn light filtering through my yellow curtains. At breakfast, my grandfather, a quiet man with rough carpenter's hands, showed me how to properly sharpen a pencil with his pocket knife before school. A sharp pencil means sharp thinking, he said in that serious way of his, though his eyes crinkled with hidden laughter. School passed in its usual blur of multiplication tables and crayon drawings. When the bell rang at 11:45, I raced to the entrance where Babushka waited, her floral headscarf tied neatly under her chin. As we walked home, she let me stop to collect shiny chestnuts that had fallen near Mrs. Zelenskaya's fence. "For our autumn collection," she said, her pockets already bulging with my finds. The first wrong note came as we turned onto our street. Mr. Petrov's dog, who always barked at passers-by, sat silent on his porch. The air smelled different too, not of fallen leaves and chimney smoke, but something metallic and sharp that made my nose wrinkle. Then came the sound. Not a gunshot like in movies. Those are clean, sudden cracks. This was a terrible, wet thump followed by a screech of metal, like when Papa had dropped our iron shovel on the garage floor last summer. The sparrows in the old birch tree exploded upward in a panic of wings, one feather drifting down to land in my hair. Babushka's hand went vice-tight around mine. Her wedding ring dug into my fingers. "Stay here," she ordered when we reached our gate, but I followed anyway, the chestnuts forgotten in my pockets. The house smelled wrong, not of soup or lemon polish, but like when Mama had cut her finger badly while cooking. That copper stench that clung to your nose. What came next exists in my memory, like a series of terrible photographs. Babushka's slipper squeaking on the linoleum as she reached the garage door. The way her floral scarf slipped back as her head jerked up. That sound, not a scream exactly, but the noise a rabbit makes when the trap snaps shut. My red sneakers sticking slightly to the floor when I stepped forward. The garage looked like a butcher shop. Grandfather's favorite plaid shirt had turned black with wetness. His work boots, always so carefully polished, were kicked at odd angles. The shotgun we weren't allowed to touch lay smoking near his outstretched hand, its barrel still pointed at the hole in his chest where his pocket watch usually rested. Babushka moved like a wind-up toy suddenly wound too tight. She shoved me backward, so hard I fell on the porch steps, then began screaming into the phone words I'd never heard her say. Through the open door, I saw blood pooling around the legs of his workbench. A single framed photo of their wedding day lying face up in the mess. His coffee mug from that morning still steaming on the shelf. The paramedics found me sitting perfectly still on the porch steps, carefully peeling chestnuts from their spiky shells as if nothing more important needed doing. A policeman tried to take them from me, but I held on so tight the spines drew blood. That night, as relatives crowded our kitchen speaking in hushed tones, I learned 3 facts. The sound I'd heard was the shotgun blast echoing off the metal tool cabinet. Grandfather had waited until he heard us at the gate to do it. No one would ever tell me why. The blood never fully came out of the garage floor's cracks. Even after Uncle Vanya scrubbed it with lye, the concrete stayed pink in places, like faded candy. Sometimes, when no one was looking, I'd press my palm against those spots, wondering if I could absorb some last piece of him through my skin. Winter came early that year. By November, snow had buried the chestnut tree's fallen fruit, and I'd learned to bite my tongue bloody rather than ask the questions that haunted me. Had he smiled when he pulled the trigger? Did he think about me at the end? Was it my fault for being late that one time I stopped to pet the neighbor's cat? The adults around me spoke in hushed voices about depression and financial troubles, but their eyes slid away from mine when I entered the room. At night, I'd lie awake listening to Babushka's muffled crying through the wall, the sound as regular as the ticking of the grandfather clock he'd built, the one that stopped working the day he died and never ran again no matter how many times we wound it. The Tragedy of 2012, Part 2. The Silence After the Storm. The days following grandfather's death moved in slow motion, as if time itself had thickened like the blood on the garage floor. The house, once warm with the smell of fresh bread and wood shavings, now smelled of disinfectant and the too sweet floral arrangements neighbors kept bringing. Every surface held a casserole dish, or a plate of pierogi that no one had the heart to eat. I remember the funeral most clearly. Not because of the ceremony itself, but because of the way the adults spoke, or rather, didn't speak around me. The morning of the burial, Babushka dressed me in a stiff black suit that scratched my neck. She knelt in front of me, her hands trembling as she adjusted my tie, her fingers cold against my skin. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't cry. Not then. "Today, you must be brave," she said, her voice hoarse. "For Dita." I nodded, though I didn't understand what being brave meant in the face of something like this. Was I supposed to not cry? Was I supposed to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen? The church was packed. People I barely recognized, old men with calloused hands, women in faded headscarves kept touching my head, murmuring things like, "Poor child," or "He's too young to understand." But I didn't understand. I understood that Dita was gone, that he had chosen to leave, and that no one wanted to talk about why. The coffin was closed. That detail stuck with me. I had expected to see him one last time, to maybe say goodbye, but the lid remained shut, sealing him away forever. When they lowered him into the ground, I stared at the polished wood, half expecting it to move, for him to sit up and say this had all been a terrible mistake. But he didn't. The dirt swallowed him whole. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the muffled voices of the adults downstairs. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid the walls might repeat their words. It was the debts, Uncle Vanya muttered. The factory shut down and the loans. "Sho," someone hissed. The boy might hear. I pressed my ear to the cold floor, straining to catch more, but the conversation shifted, fading into murmurs. The next morning, I wandered into Dita's workshop, a place I had always been forbidden to enter alone. The room smelled of sawdust and oil, the same as always, but now it felt hollow, like a shell of what it had been. His tools were still laid out neatly on the bench, a half-finished birdhouse clamped in place. A thin layer of dust had already settled over everything. I climbed onto his stool, my legs dangling high above the floor, and picked up a chisel. The wood handle was smooth from years of use, the metal blade still sharp. I ran my finger along the edge, wondering how many things he had built with it, how many times his hands had held it just like this. Then I saw the notebook. It was tucked beneath a stack of sandpaper, its cover worn and creased. I pulled it out carefully, as if it might crumble in my hands. Inside, page after page was filled with Dita's tight, precise handwriting, numbers, dates, names. Oleg, 20,000 rubles due March. Bank, payment missed again. Lena's medicine, too much. I didn't understand most of it, but the numbers were underlined so hard the pen had torn the paper in places. At the back of the notebook, tucked between the pages, was a folded letter. I opened it. My fingers shook as I recognized Babushka's handwriting, not her usual neat script, but something rushed, desperate. "Mikhail, please. We'll find a way. The boy needs you. I need you." The date at the top was the day before he died. The sound of footsteps made me slam the notebook shut. Babushka stood in the doorway, her face pale. "What are you doing in here?" Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. I held out the notebook. Did Dita owe people money? Her breath hitched. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she took the notebook from me and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Come," she said softly. "It's time for lunch." She never answered my question. The weeks blurred together after that. School became a strange, distant thing. Teachers spoke to me gently. Classmates avoided me as if grief were contagious. I spent most days sitting by the window, watching the world outside move on without me. Then one evening the men came. They knocked too hard on the door, their voices loud and impatient. Babushka shoved me into the pantry, hissing, "Stay quiet no matter what." Through the crack in the door, I watched as two men in leather jackets stepped inside. One of them, a bald man with a gold tooth, slapped a piece of paper on the table. "Your husband's debts don't disappear just because he did," he said, grinning like it was a joke. Babushka's back was rigid. "We have nothing left." The bald man looked around the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the radio, the silverware, the wedding photo on the wall. Then his gaze slid toward the pantry. My heart stopped. But he just smirked. "We'll be back." When they left, Babushka sagged against the counter, her hands shaking. I crept out of the pantry, staring at the paper they'd left behind. It was a list. Our house was on it. That night, Babushka burned Dita's notebook in the stove. I watched as the pages curled and blackened, the numbers dissolving into ash. "We're leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where?" She didn't answer. The next morning, she packed our things into 2 small suitcases. The wedding photo came with us. The radio didn't. As we stepped outside, I glanced back at the house, the garden where Dita had taught me to plant tomatoes, the garage where he'd fixed my bicycle, the workshop where he'd left behind a lifetime of tools. I never saw any of it again. The train to Babushka's sister's village smelled of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage. We sat on hard benches near the window, our 2 suitcases wedged between us like barricades. Every jolt of the carriage made the wedding photo in Babushka's bag knock against her hip, the glass in the frame rattling like a warning. "Remember," she whispered as the city disappeared behind us, "your name is Sasha now. You're my sister's grandson, visiting for the summer." I wanted to ask why, but the look in her eyes stopped me. Outside, the birch trees blurred into a green streak as the train picked up speed. Aunt Irina's village was a cluster of wooden houses clinging to the edge of a forest. The air smelled different here, Not of car exhaust and hot pavement, but of pine needles and the sharp tang of the river that curled around the village like a protective arm. "You'll be safe here," Aunt Irina said that first night, stroking my hair with hands rough from farm work. But when she thought I wasn't looking, I saw her exchange a glance with Babushka that made my stomach twist. The lies began immediately. At the village school, I became Sasha Petrov, a quiet boy from Moscow whose parents were working abroad. The teacher, a tired woman with ink-stained fingers, marked me present without looking up. The children stared at my city shoes and the way I mispronounced local words, but no one asked questions. We lived in the back room of Aunt Irina's bakery. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the women whisper over cups of overbrewed tea. "They came to Marinsk last week," Aunt Irina murmured one evening. I pressed my ear to the thin wall. "Took the Kovalev's tractor over some gambling debt." Babushka's voice was tight. "Did they ask about?" "Not yet." A floorboard creaked as one of them stood. "We should move again before winter." That was when I first understood. We weren't just hiding. We were being hunted. The nightmares started soon after. Every night, I'd wake gasping, the sound of that shotgun blast echoing in my skull. Sometimes I'd see Dita standing at the foot of my bed, his chest a gaping hole, his mouth moving but no words coming out. Other times it was the bald man from our kitchen, his gold tooth glinting as he reached for me. Babushka stopped sleeping altogether. I'd find her at dawn, staring at the samovar as it boiled dry, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. The only time she showed emotion was when the village priest mentioned memorial prayers. "No," she said too quickly. "No prayers." The priest frowned but didn't press. Later, I heard him tell the schoolteacher that some souls were too heavy to lift to heaven. Winter came early that year. By November, the river froze solid, and the village children dared each other to skate on the thin ice near the center. I watched from the bank, my hands shoved deep in pockets that still smelled faintly of Dita's workshop. Then the rumors started. A black car had been seen on the county road. Strangers asking about a woman and a boy from the city. The village headman doubled the night watch patrols. "They're close," Aunt Irina said as she packed our bags again. This time, there were no suitcases, just 2 knapsacks with bread, cheese, and all the money they'd scraped together sewn into the lining of my coat. We left before dawn on December 3rd. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and our breath hung in frozen clouds as we picked our way down to the riverbank. A fisherman's boat waited there, its hull scraping against the ice. 3 days downriver, the old fisherman muttered as he helped us in. "Stay on until the concrete bridge." Babushka clutched my hand as the boat slid into the current. Behind us, the village disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom. Ahead, the river curved into a tunnel of bare trees, their branches clawing at the pinkening sky. That was when I saw it, a wisp of smoke rising from Aunt Irina's chimney. Except we'd doused the stove hours ago. The first gunshot cracked across the water just as we rounded the bend. The gunshot echoed across the frozen river like the crack of splitting ice. I felt Babushka's grip tighten around my hand hard enough to grind the bones together as the fisherman cursed and plunged his oar deeper into the black water. The little boat rocked violently, sending icy spray over the sides that stung like needles against my face. "Down," the fisherman barked, and we threw ourselves flat against the damp planks just as a second shot whined past, splintering the wood near where my head had been. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the river's metallic scent, creating a terrible perfume that would haunt me for years. Through the slats of the boat, I saw figures running along the shoreline, 3 dark shapes moving with purpose through the skeletal birch trees. The bald man's gold tooth caught the rising sun as he shouted something I couldn't understand over the rush of the current. One of his companions raised a rifle again, but we were already rounding the bend, the river pulling us away with merciful indifference. The next 3 days passed in a haze of terror and cold. We didn't dare stop, not even when darkness fell and the temperature dropped enough to make our teeth chatter uncontrollably. The fisherman, who never told us his name, kept us moving through the nights, steering by moonlight when the current allowed. Babushka wrapped me in every spare scrap of clothing, but the cold still found its way in, creeping up from the damp floorboards to settle in my bones. On the second night, when the fisherman finally slept, Babushka pressed something cold and hard into my hand. It was Dita's pocket watch, the one he always carried in his breast pocket, the one that should have been buried with him. The glass was cracked, and when I turned it over, I saw dark stains in the intricate engravings that no amount of polishing could remove. "He gave this to me that morning," Babushka whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping water. "Told me to keep it safe for you until—" She trailed off, her fingers brushing the cracked face. "There's a compartment in the back." My numb fingers found the tiny latch. Inside, folded so small it could barely be seen, was a scrap of paper with a single word written in Dita's precise handwriting. Zaitsev. The name meant nothing to me then. Dawn on the third day revealed the concrete bridge the fisherman had described, a hulking Soviet-era structure stained with rust and graffiti. As we drifted closer, figures emerged from the shadows beneath its arches. My heart leapt into my throat until I recognized Aunt Irina's stooped silhouette. "You're alive," she breathed as she helped drag the boat ashore. Her hands were bandaged, the wrappings stained an ominous brown. "They came an hour after you left. Burn the bakery." Babushka made a sound like a wounded animal. "The debts." "Not debts." Aunt Irina's eyes darted to me, then away. "Not just debts." The safe house was a hunter's cabin deep in the woods, its log walls stuffed with moss against the cold. That first night, as the women spoke in hushed tones by the fire, I pretended to sleep. The truth came out in fractured pieces. Dita hadn't just owed money. He'd seen something involving the bald man and a regional politician whose name made Aunt Irina cross herself. There were mentions of a ledger, of payments made and secrets kept, of a warning Dita had ignored until it was too late. The pocket watch grew heavier in my hand with each revelation. Winter tightened its grip. The cabin's single room smelled of damp wool and the medicinal herbs Aunt Irina boiled for Babushka's worsening cough. We lived like ghosts, venturing out only at dusk to check the rabbit traps or gather firewood. Then, in early February, the nightmares changed. Instead of Dita's silent scream, I began dreaming of a room with green walls and a desk piled high with ledgers. A man, not the bald one, but someone important-looking with a military posture, would appear, pointing angrily at pages filled with numbers that bled like the garage floor. Always, just before waking, the man would say 2 words, "Find Zaitsev." I told Babushka about the dreams one morning as she combed the lice from my hair. Her hands stilled immediately. "Where did you hear that name?" "The watch," I admitted. The color drained from her face. She stood so abruptly the wooden comb snapped in her grip. That night, I woke to find her and Aunt Irina arguing fiercely by the embers of the fire. "Too dangerous," Aunt Irina was hissing. "He left it for a reason," Babushka countered. "Or to protect him from ever knowing." A floorboard creaked under my shifting weight, and both women fell silent. In the firelight, I saw something I'd never seen before, fear in Babushka's eyes when she looked at me. The thaw came early that year. By March, the snow had receded enough to reveal patches of frozen mud and the first brave shoots of winter wheat. It was on one of these unseasonably warm mornings that the bald man found us. I was gathering kindling near the stream when a twig snapped behind me. There was no time to run, no time to scream. His hand clamped over my mouth, the gold tooth glinting as he leaned close enough for me to smell the vodka on his breath. "Quiet now, little rabbit," he murmured. "Or Grandma gets a bullet like Grandpa did." They'd been watching the cabin for weeks, waiting. The bald man's companions, 2 younger men with the blank eyes of hired muscle, dragged Babushka and Aunt Irina outside. One of them held a pistol casually against Aunt Irina's temple while the bald man made his demands. "The ledger," he said, crouching to my eye level. "Where did your grandfather hide it?" I stared at him, uncomprehending. He sighed, then backhanded me hard enough to send me sprawling into the mud. Babushka screamed, lunging forward, only to be yanked back by her hair. "Last chance," the bald man said, pulling a familiar object from his coat pocket, Dita's wedding photo, the glass now shattered. "The numbers in the watch. The name. What do they mean?" Something in me broke then. Maybe it was the sight of Babushka's tears. Maybe it was the way the bald man held the photo, like it was trash. Or maybe it was simply that, after all these months of running, I was tired of being afraid. I spat blood at his polished shoes. "Go to hell." His smile never wavered as he straightened, nodding to his men. "Burn it." The cabin went up like tinder, flames licking hungrily at the dry logs. The bald man kept us forced to our knees, watching as everything, our clothes, the few keepsakes we'd salvaged, Dita's photo, vanished into the inferno. It was only when the roof collapsed with a groan that the gunshots rang out. The bald man's had snapped back first, a dark flower blooming between his eyes. His companions barely had time to turn before they fell too, their weapons clattering to the ground. From the trees emerged a figure in a long gray coat, rifle smoking in his hands. He moved with purpose, checking each body before approaching us. When he removed his fur hat, I saw the family resemblance immediately. The same sharp nose as Dita, the same stubborn set to the jaw. "Uncle Zaitsev, I presume?" Babushka said hoarsely, clutching my shoulder. The man nodded, his eyes lingering on me. "Took you long enough to call." As the cabin burned behind us, he led us to a waiting truck, its engine already running. No explanations. No apologies. Just 3 more ghosts slipping away into the twilight. In the end, we never went back for Dita's ledger. Never learned the full truth behind those bleeding numbers. Some secrets, it seemed, were meant to stay buried. just like the man who died for them. The last thing I saw as the truck pulled away was the bald man's gold tooth glinting in the firelight, his smile finally wiped clean. And for the first time since that terrible October morning, I felt something almost like peace.